Emma stood by the window, watching as David packed his suitcase. His work trip was sudden, and she could feel the weight of his absence settling in. The house, usually filled with the sound of their conversations and the occasional laughter, now felt unnaturally quiet. The stillness around her seemed to stretch longer with every minute. She tried to shake off the unease that had settled in her chest, but it lingered. David was always gone for work, but this time, it felt different. The thought of being alone in the house for the next few days didn't seem so comforting anymore. Once David was gone, Emma wandered through the empty rooms, trying to fill the space with something, anything, to distract her from the silence. Her phone buzzed, and she looked at the message from her neighbor, Jason. They had always been friendly, waving across the yard or exchanging pleasantries whenever their paths crossed. Moments later, there was a knock at the door. She opened it to find Jason standing outside with a friendly smile. "Hey, Emma. I hope I'm not interrupting, but I've got a package for you. Could you sign for it?" Emma smiled, nodding. "Of course. It's no problem." She signed for the package, and Jason stepped inside to place it on the counter. As he did, their conversation started off casual, about the weather, the neighborhood, and how their days were going. But as the minutes passed, the words shifted. There was something more personal in their exchange, a kind of unspoken curiosity. They both found themselves talking about their lives, their routines, and everything in between. For Emma, the conversation felt easy, even though she wasn't used to opening up like this. There was something about Jason, his easygoing manner, his quiet confidence, that put her at ease. At some point, their friendly banter veered into unexpected territory. A laugh escaped Emma's lips as Jason made a light-hearted remark. She caught herself staring at him for a moment longer than usual. It wasn't just his words that caught her attention, it was something in his eyes, something that made her heart skip a beat. For the first time, she noticed the way he looked at her, the way his gaze lingered just a little too long. Jason leaned back slightly, his smile genuine but edged with something else, a spark, a chemistry that Emma hadn't anticipated. She could feel it, the electric current that passed between them. The conversation continued, but Emma's thoughts were elsewhere now, caught in a tide she hadn't seen coming. The idea of spending more time with him suddenly seemed appealing. Later that evening, Jason stopped by again, a visit that seemed casual enough at first. They laughed, joked about the little things, and opened a bottle of wine. But this time, the atmosphere between them felt different. It wasn't just the wine or the quiet of the evening. It was the way they talked, the way they shared glances that lingered just a bit too long. Each word felt heavier, and each laugh seemed to hold something more, something that neither of them was quite ready to acknowledge. They sat close, the distance between them narrowing with every passing minute. Emma could feel the warmth of his presence beside her, and a part of her, the part that had been feeling alone for so long, welcomed it. Yet, in the back of her mind, she couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't just an innocent evening. It was something else. Something that could easily spiral out of control. And she wasn't sure if she was ready for that, but she wasn't sure if she could stop it either. The following evening, Emma found herself thinking about Jason again. It had only been a day since their last conversation, but the tension that had started to build between them refused to fade. She sat on the couch, absently scrolling through her phone, her mind drifting back to the moments they had shared. The way his eyes had lingered on her, the sound of his laugh in the quiet of the room, it was all too easy to remember. Just then, the doorbell rang. Her heart skipped a beat as she opened the door to find Jason standing there once again, a casual smile on his face. "Hey, Emma. I was in the neighborhood and thought I'd stop by. Mind if I come in for a minute?" She hesitated for a split second, but the invitation slipped from her lips before she could stop herself. "Sure, come on in." Jason stepped inside, and the moment the door closed behind him, Emma felt the air shift. It was the same as before, comfortable, yet charged with an energy she couldn't ignore. She gestured to the couch, and they both sat down, the conversation starting off light as usual. But this time, there was something different. The tension between them seemed palpable, hanging in the air like a weight neither of them could shake. As they talked, Emma noticed how closely Jason was sitting to her, how his words seemed to carry more weight than they had the night before. She felt drawn to him, the pull of attraction becoming undeniable. The conversation drifted to more personal topics, and Emma realized just how easy it was to talk to him. There was something about him that made her feel seen, understood in a way she hadn't felt in a long time. Jason's smile was warmer now, more intimate, and Emma could feel her heart beating faster in her chest. She shifted slightly on the couch, trying to ignore the feeling of his gaze on her, the way it made her skin prickle. She could feel the chemistry between them growing stronger with every passing second, and she couldn't deny it any longer. The line between friendship and something more was beginning to blur, and it terrified her, even as a part of her welcomed it. He leaned in a little closer, his voice lowering, as if the change in the air was something they both understood without needing to speak it aloud. Emma's breath caught in her throat as he brushed his hand against hers. It was a fleeting touch, almost accidental, but the electricity between them was undeniable. She couldn't help but look at him, meeting his eyes, and for a moment, everything else seemed to fade away. The conversation fell silent, the space between them charged with something unspoken, and Emma found herself inching closer to him without even realizing it. Jason leaned in again, his face just inches from hers. There was no turning back now. She could feel the tension in the air, thick and heavy, and her heart raced with anticipation. Then, without warning, Jason kissed her. The kiss was soft at first, almost hesitant, as if he was waiting for her to pull away. But Emma didn't move. She stayed there, frozen for a moment, her mind spinning. The kiss deepened, and she found herself responding, her hands reaching up to touch his face as the world around them seemed to disappear. For a heartbeat, it felt like everything was perfect. It felt like everything made sense in that moment, and she could almost forget the mess of emotions that were tangled inside her. But as the kiss broke, reality rushed back in, and Emma was left standing at the edge of a precipice she wasn't sure she was ready to cross. She hesitated, her thoughts spinning, but there was nothing she could do. The attraction between them was too strong, and deep down, she knew that she didn't want it to end. Jason pulled back, his gaze never leaving hers. He didn't say anything, but the unspoken understanding between them was clear. They were on the verge of something neither of them could undo, and neither of them seemed to want to stop. Emma's heart was racing as she tried to make sense of everything. What had just happened? What would this mean? But in the end, it didn't matter. She didn't have the answers, and for the first time in a long time, she didn't want them. All she wanted was to stay in this moment, in the warmth of Jason's presence, and to forget everything else. But she couldn't. And she knew it. The line between right and wrong had already begun to blur, and there was no going back now. The morning after their kiss, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed. The events of the previous night played in her mind over and over again, each moment like a ripple in the water, spreading farther the longer she thought about it. She should have felt guilty, should have stopped herself, but instead, there was a strange sense of exhilaration that refused to leave her. She tried to go about her day as usual, cooking breakfast, doing the laundry, answering emails, but her mind kept returning to Jason. The way his lips had felt against hers, the way her body had responded to him. It wasn't just the physical attraction, it was something more, something deeper that had begun to take root inside her. And it was growing. Her phone buzzed on the counter, pulling her from her thoughts. It was a message from Jason. "Hey, I'm just around the corner. Can I drop by? Hope it's not too soon." Emma stared at the message, her heart rate picking up. She wasn't sure what she expected, but part of her had known that this wasn't the end. That it couldn't be. She hesitated for a moment, her mind a whirlwind of conflicting thoughts. She should say no, she should put an end to this before it went too far, but instead, her fingers moved without thinking. "Sure, come over." The moment she hit send, Emma felt a rush of nerves flood her. She wasn't ready for this. She wasn't ready for what might happen next, but it was too late now. Jason arrived a short time later, and when she opened the door, he greeted her with that same easy smile that made her heart flutter. "Hey, Emma," he said, his voice low, as though they shared some secret that no one else knew. "Hey," she replied, stepping aside to let him in. They moved into the living room, and for a moment, everything felt strangely normal. They sat down, exchanged a few words, but the silence between them was thick with unspoken tension. Emma could feel the weight of his presence beside her, the heat radiating off of him as if he were pulling her in without saying a word. Their conversation started off casual, but it wasn't long before the air between them became charged again, each word more meaningful than the last. There was something in Jason's gaze that made her pulse quicken, a hunger in his eyes that mirrored her own. Emma knew that look. She had seen it in the eyes of lovers before, but this time, it was different. This time, it wasn't just about the attraction. It was about the connection, the undeniable pull between them that neither of them could ignore. Without thinking, she shifted closer to him, her body betraying her as she leaned in slightly. Jason's eyes flicked down to her lips, and for a moment, neither of them spoke. The room felt smaller now, the space between them shrinking until it was almost non-existent. Then, without a word, Jason's hand found hers. It was a simple touch at first, just his fingers brushing against hers, but the moment their skin made contact, Emma's breath caught in her throat. The electricity between them was immediate, and she felt it all the way to her core. His hand tightened around hers, pulling her closer, and in the next breath, his lips were on hers again. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. Their kiss was deep, urgent, and everything Emma had tried to resist in the past few days came rushing to the surface. Her body responded instinctively, pressing closer to him as their lips moved together. The world outside seemed to disappear. There was nothing but the heat between them, the way they fit together so perfectly, so seamlessly. She couldn't think. She didn't want to. Emma could feel Jason's hand sliding down her arm, pulling her closer still. Her heart pounded in her chest, and for a moment, she forgot everything else, David, the guilt, the consequences. All that mattered was the way Jason made her feel, the way he was making her feel alive in a way she hadn't realized she was missing. But as the kiss deepened, reality clawed its way back into Emma's mind. She knew this wasn't right. She knew she shouldn't be doing this, but she couldn't stop. She didn't want to stop. When they finally pulled apart, Emma was breathless. She looked up at Jason, her thoughts swirling in a haze. She couldn't tell if this was just the beginning or if it was already too late. All she knew was that she couldn't turn back now. Jason's gaze softened as he studied her. There was no shame, no apology in his eyes, just a quiet understanding, as if he knew what had just happened between them was inevitable. For a moment, Emma tried to find the words to say, but none came. All she could do was sit there, her heart still racing, knowing that whatever happened next, there was no going back. The following day, Emma couldn't seem to shake the weight of what had happened. Every moment since Jason had left her house was marked by a sense of disorientation. Her mind felt like it was constantly spinning, replaying the kiss over and over again. Each time, the guilt threatened to settle in, but there was something else too, something she couldn't ignore. Desire. Longing. A pull that she hadn't felt in so long, and yet it felt like a chain she wasn't ready to break free from. The morning passed slowly, and Emma found herself constantly glancing at her phone, half expecting a message from Jason. She told herself she shouldn't want it, that she shouldn't be waiting for it. But she was. And when the message came, her pulse quickened. "Hey, Emma. Can I come by tonight?" Her heart skipped a beat. She hesitated only for a moment before typing back. "Sure. See you later." It was as if there was some unspoken agreement between them, something neither of them needed to say aloud. She didn't know what she was getting herself into, but she couldn't stop it. The desire to see him, to feel that rush again, was too strong. When Jason arrived, Emma was already on edge. The house felt small with the tension between them, and she knew, deep down, that she wasn't being honest with herself. She tried to push those thoughts aside as they exchanged pleasantries, but it was hard to ignore the way her heart pounded with every word he spoke. Jason was different now. There was no longer any pretense between them. They sat down, just like before, but this time, the air was thick with anticipation. Emma could feel Jason's presence more acutely, his every move drawing her in. They spoke, but their words felt like background noise. The way he looked at her, the way his body was positioned so close to hers, it was impossible to ignore. She shifted slightly on the couch, trying to make herself comfortable, but the proximity was too much. Jason's hand brushed against hers again, sending a shock through her body. This time, neither of them pulled away. It was a subtle thing, a touch that shouldn't have mattered, but it did. Emma could feel the heat radiating from him, and her pulse quickened as she tried to keep her composure. Her mind screamed at her to stop, to pull back before it went too far, but her body betrayed her. Jason moved closer, his gaze never leaving hers. There was something in the way he looked at her, something that made her heart race, that made her forget everything else. Without a word, he leaned in again, his lips capturing hers in a kiss that was desperate, hungry. Emma's breath caught in her throat as she kissed him back, the world around them falling away. There was no turning back now. She could feel herself losing control, and she didn't care. She didn't want to care. In that moment, everything seemed to blur, the guilt, the confusion, the consequences. All of it melted away as they fell into each other. She felt his hands on her body, pulling her closer, and she couldn't deny how much she wanted it. The kiss broke, and Emma looked at Jason, her breath shallow. Her mind was racing, trying to make sense of what had just happened. This wasn't what she wanted. Or was it? She didn't know anymore. Her phone buzzed, pulling her from the moment. It was David. "Everything okay?" the message read. Emma froze, staring at the screen. Her heart hammered in her chest as a rush of panic swept over her. She quickly typed a response, trying to sound casual, trying to hide the turmoil that was swirling inside her. "Yeah, everything's fine. Just at home." She hit send and put the phone down, but the knot in her stomach only tightened. The truth, the reality of the situation, felt like a crushing weight on her chest. She was lying. She was caught in a lie so tangled, she couldn't see a way out. Jason watched her with an unreadable expression, his gaze knowing. He didn't say anything, but there was a quiet understanding between them. They both knew what was happening, even if neither of them acknowledged it. Emma tried to focus on something else, anything else, but all she could think about was the way Jason's touch made her feel, the way she had let herself fall deeper into this. She excused herself to the kitchen, needing a moment to breathe. The clink of glasses, the soft hum of the refrigerator, it all seemed so distant, so insignificant in comparison to what had just happened. She leaned against the counter, her head spinning as she fought to steady her breathing. What was she doing? When she returned to the living room, Jason was still there, his eyes never leaving hers. There was no going back now. She had crossed a line, and now everything would change. She could feel it in her bones. The night dragged on in a blur of whispered words and fleeting touches. But beneath it all, Emma knew she was on the edge of something she couldn't undo. And no matter how hard she tried to stop it, she couldn't help but feel like she was already too far gone. The days following their heated kiss felt like an endless cycle of temptation and guilt. Emma couldn't stop thinking about Jason. Each time she saw him, the pull between them grew stronger. The small, innocent touches, the heated glances, they had all led to something she couldn't escape. And with each passing moment, the line between right and wrong seemed to blur even more. Her life, once simple and predictable, was now filled with lies, contradictions, and a growing sense of chaos. It was like living in two worlds. One was the reality she had built with David, the husband she had promised to love, the life she had carefully cultivated. And the other was the one she shared with Jason, the forbidden world that was both thrilling and dangerous. Emma tried to convince herself that it was just a moment of weakness, that it was a fluke, a passing infatuation. But deep down, she knew better. The attraction wasn't just physical, it was emotional, a connection that had taken root and refused to let go. Jason was no longer just her neighbor. He was someone she couldn't stop thinking about, someone she craved. One evening, after David had gone to bed, Emma found herself standing at the door again, waiting for Jason to arrive. The house was quiet, the silence suffocating, and she couldn't stand it. She had been pretending for so long, pretending that everything was fine, that nothing had changed. But it had. She had changed. When Jason knocked on the door, her heart raced. This wasn't just a casual visit anymore. This was something more, something she couldn't deny. Jason stepped inside, his gaze settling on her immediately, and she could see it in his eyes, the same desire, the same hunger that had been there from the beginning. There was no pretense now. No pretending that this was anything other than what it was. They both knew what was happening, and neither of them was ready to stop. They didn't say much at first. The words between them seemed insignificant. All that mattered was the space between them closing, the heat between them growing. Emma's pulse quickened as Jason reached for her, his touch slow and deliberate. He pulled her toward him, his lips finding hers in a kiss that was deeper than any they had shared before. This time, there was no hesitation. No uncertainty. This wasn't just a kiss, it was a claim, an undeniable assertion of their desires. Emma responded immediately, her body pressing into his as she lost herself in the moment. She knew it was wrong. She knew it could destroy everything, but she couldn't stop. Jason's hands moved over her, pulling her closer, and Emma felt her resolve weaken. It was like the floodgates had opened, and all her pent-up desires, her longing, came rushing to the surface. She didn't care about the consequences. She didn't care about the life she had built. All that mattered was this moment, this connection. They stumbled toward the couch, hands never leaving each other's bodies, their kisses growing more desperate, more urgent. Emma's mind raced, a mix of guilt and desire that twisted together in a way she couldn't separate. But the guilt was starting to fade, pushed away by the overwhelming need she felt. It was like a drug she couldn't quit, and she was too far gone to turn back. The night unfolded in a blur of passion and longing. Emma didn't stop to think. She didn't stop to question. She just gave in, allowing herself to feel everything she had been denying. Jason's touch, his presence, filled the emptiness she had been carrying for so long. When the dawn finally broke, Emma lay beside him, her body still buzzing with the intensity of what they had just shared. The quiet of the morning seemed to mock her, reminding her of the reality she had left behind. But she couldn't bring herself to regret it, not yet. In that moment, nothing else mattered. All that mattered was the man lying beside her, the man who had pulled her into this world she wasn't ready to leave. But as she looked at him, she knew it couldn't last. The world she had built with David, the life she had promised to protect, was slipping further and further away. And no matter how much she tried to ignore it, the truth was that she was now standing on the edge of something she couldn't undo. Emma sat quietly in the living room, the glass of wine in her hand doing little to ease the unease that had settled in her chest. The thrill of her time with Jason seemed to overshadow every thought, yet the weight of the impending consequences kept gnawing at her. David's message about returning home the next day lingered in her mind. It was a reminder of everything she stood to lose, but no matter how many times she read it, the guilt couldn't overpower the draw she felt toward Jason. As the evening passed, Emma found herself waiting for something, anything, to distract her from her spiraling thoughts. A knock at the door snapped her back to reality. She knew who it was before she even opened it. Jason stood there, his smile as casual as ever, but his eyes held an intensity she hadn't noticed before. They exchanged pleasantries, but it was clear that something hung in the air between them. Emma's heart raced as she led him into the living room. They settled on the couch, but the space between them felt too close, charged with a tension they both tried to ignore. As the night wore on, Emma tried to focus on the conversation, but her mind kept drifting. It wasn't just Jason's presence that unsettled her, it was the life she was supposed to have with David that now seemed distant, fragile. Every word she spoke to Jason felt like a betrayal, yet she couldn't bring herself to stop. Then the doorbell rang. Emma's heart stopped. David. He was back early. She glanced at Jason, who seemed unfazed, but Emma's pulse quickened as she moved to answer the door. When she opened it, David stood there with his suitcase, a smile on his face that didn't reach his eyes. He stepped inside, his gaze flicking between Emma and Jason before Emma quickly masked her surprise. Jason left swiftly, his departure almost too smooth, and Emma couldn't shake the feeling that he knew something was wrong. She closed the door behind him, her mind racing as David settled into the living room. David's demeanor had changed. There was something in the way he looked at her, a quiet suspicion that made Emma's anxiety spike. As she tried to keep the conversation light, the guilt weighed heavily on her. How long could she continue living this lie? How long before David uncovered the truth? The night stretched on, and Emma knew that the walls she had carefully built around her life were beginning to crumble. Days passed in a blur, and Emma's unease grew with each interaction. The familiar comfort of her life with David seemed more like a distant memory, a facade she could no longer maintain. Every visit from Jason only deepened her involvement in the tangled web she had spun, and the weight of the lie she was living with grew heavier. Her thoughts, once consumed by routine, were now constantly occupied by the pull between the two men, the two worlds. One evening, while she was sitting at the kitchen table, her phone buzzed. The sound was sharp in the silence, and Emma's heart skipped a beat as she looked down at the message. It was from Jason, as expected, but this time, there was something different in his tone. I think David knows something. He's been acting strange lately. Are you okay? Emma's breath caught in her throat. Jason had always been perceptive, but the words struck a nerve. She hadn't noticed anything overt, but the tension in her interactions with David had certainly grown. She couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, that David was becoming more distant, more suspicious. Later that night, while David was in the other room, Emma sat in the living room, staring at her phone. She replayed the message in her mind. Had David started to suspect? The idea gnawed at her, but there was a part of her that couldn't face the truth. She didn't want to believe it, even though the signs were right in front of her. The following day, as she was folding laundry, she overheard David's voice in the hallway. He was on the phone with someone, his tone low and urgent. Emma froze, her heart pounding in her chest as she caught snippets of the conversation. It was a name she didn't recognize, a conversation that sounded too familiar. We need to talk. I can't keep this from her anymore. Her stomach turned. The realization hit her hard. David was hiding something too. The weight of his words, I can't keep this from her, sent a chill down her spine. Her suspicions were no longer just a gut feeling, they were becoming a reality. She had been so focused on her own secrets that she hadn't noticed David's. As the hours passed, Emma's anxiety only grew. She needed to know more. She couldn't just leave this hanging in the air. She waited until David was distracted with something else, then slipped into the bedroom, her hands trembling as she reached for his phone. With a glance over her shoulder to make sure no one was watching, she unlocked it. The messages were there, plain as day. The text threads were full of exchanges with a woman whose name Emma had never seen before. There was no mistaking it, David was having an affair. Emma's heart sank as she scrolled through the messages, each word confirming the suspicions she had tried to deny. She felt a rush of emotions, anger, betrayal, confusion. She hadn't been the only one lying, the only one hiding something. In that moment, everything she had believed about her marriage felt like a lie. She quickly locked the phone and set it back down, her hands shaking. The weight of everything, the affair, the betrayal, her own involvement with Jason, was too much to bear. She wanted to scream, to confront David, but a deep, paralyzing fear held her in place. How would she even begin to approach this? How could she face him knowing that her own actions had led them both down this destructive path? The truth had come crashing down on her, and now there was no turning back. She was trapped between two lies, both unraveling, both threatening to expose everything. The once solid ground beneath her seemed to crumble, and Emma found herself standing on the edge of everything she had built, unsure of what came next. The silence in the house felt suffocating, each second dragging on as she tried to process the enormity of it all. The weight of the revelations from the previous days had started to take its toll on Emma. The guilt, the shame, and the overwhelming sense of betrayal from both sides had her feeling like she was drowning. Jason's presence, once a source of excitement and escape, now felt like another burden she couldn't carry. It was as though every part of her life was unraveling, and there was nothing she could do to stop it. That evening, she sat alone in the living room, staring blankly at the walls. She couldn't remember the last time she had felt at peace. Her thoughts were clouded by the images of Jason and David, the two men who had now become the center of her chaotic world. She couldn't continue this way, but she wasn't sure how to end it. Jason had been calling and texting more frequently, his tone growing more urgent with each message. "Are you okay? I need to see you again." The messages piled up, but Emma found herself avoiding them. The last thing she wanted was to slip deeper into the mess she had already created. She needed to break free from the cycle, to reclaim some semblance of control, but every time Jason's name appeared on her screen, the pull to respond became stronger. She was caught in a web of her own making, trapped between the life she had promised to David and the one she had built with Jason. Every lie, every secret, seemed to weave them both tighter into her world, and she was suffocating under the pressure. That night, Jason showed up at her door, just as she had expected. His presence filled the space, but instead of the usual warmth, she felt nothing but the cold weight of her decisions. He smiled at her, as if nothing had changed, but Emma could see through it. She could see the desperation in his eyes, the way he was clinging to something that wasn't real. "I can't do this anymore," Emma finally said, her voice barely above a whisper. She had been carrying these words for so long, but saying them out loud felt like a release. "I need to step back." Jason's expression faltered, but he didn't argue. He had always known that this day might come, but now that it was here, neither of them knew how to navigate the aftermath. They stood there in silence, neither knowing what to say. Emma wanted to tell him everything, about her marriage, about the betrayal she had uncovered, but the words caught in her throat. Instead, she simply nodded, and Jason left, the door closing behind him with a finality that Emma couldn't ignore. In the days that followed, Emma tried to focus on her life with David. She had no choice but to confront the reality that they were both living in lies. The tension between them had been palpable for weeks, but now, with the truth about David's affair hanging in the air, Emma couldn't help but wonder if there was any way to salvage their relationship. David came home late one evening, his usual smile not quite reaching his eyes. Emma had already confronted the idea that their marriage might be over, but when he walked through the door, she couldn't help but feel a flicker of hope. She wanted him to be the man she had married, the one who had been so devoted, but the cracks in their relationship were too deep to ignore. They sat down together, but the conversation they needed to have wasn't happening. Instead, they talked around the issue, avoiding the truth that hung between them like a thick fog. Emma couldn't bring herself to confront David about his affair, not yet. She wasn't sure if she ever would. Emma's world had become a blur of half-truths and missed opportunities. She felt like she was drifting in a sea of guilt and confusion, unable to find solid ground. The space between her and David had grown wider, the silence in their home louder. She had tried to push Jason out of her life, but the pull was still there, lingering just beneath the surface. One afternoon, as she was cleaning the bedroom, she noticed something strange. A small envelope was tucked under David's pillow, something she hadn't seen before. Curiosity gnawed at her, and without thinking, she opened it. Inside was a photograph, one she had never seen before. It was of David and the woman he had been texting, the one whose name had appeared on his phone so many times. The woman he had been having an affair with. The image burned into her mind as the truth settled in. It wasn't just a casual flirtation. It was a full-blown relationship. Her husband had been hiding it from her all along. The betrayal hit her like a physical blow. She had already suspected something, but seeing the proof in front of her felt like her world had shattered. Her hands shook as she folded the photograph and shoved it back into the envelope. She needed to confront David, to demand answers, but a part of her was terrified. She had already crossed so many lines, already lost so much, that confronting him now felt like the last step in a journey she wasn't ready to take. Later that evening, as she and David sat down for dinner, the silence between them felt deafening. Emma's mind raced with 1,000 questions, but she couldn't bring herself to ask any of them. She knew the truth now. She knew the depths of his betrayal, but she didn't have the strength to face him yet. The photograph had changed everything. The secrets had been exposed, and now there was no going back. Emma had already lost her grip on her marriage, but the discovery of David's affair left her with only one question: what now? How could she possibly move forward when everything she had known was built on lies? Emma sat at the kitchen table, the familiar hum of the house a stark contrast to the storm raging inside her. The photograph, still tucked away in her drawer, had shifted something deep within her. David's betrayal had been laid bare, and the weight of the truth pressed down on her chest with a heaviness she could no longer ignore. She had spent so long lying to herself, convincing herself that things could be fixed, that everything could go back to normal. But now, she knew better. The tension in the house had become unbearable. Every glance, every word exchanged with David felt like a lie. He was oblivious to the discovery, still acting as if everything was fine. But Emma couldn't pretend anymore. She couldn't keep up the charade. The thought of confronting him loomed over her, but she didn't know how to start. How could she possibly face the man she had once trusted completely, knowing that he had betrayed her in such a deep way? She had to make a choice, and the weight of that decision hung heavily over her. The thought of ending things with David was almost unbearable. The idea of stepping into the unknown, of leaving behind the life they had built together, was terrifying. But the alternative, living a life of lies and deceit, felt even worse. That night, Emma couldn't sleep. The images of David with another woman, the words of his secret messages, haunted her. She knew what she had to do, but the fear of the unknown kept her paralyzed. Would David fight for their marriage? Would he even care? The questions circled in her mind as the hours stretched on, each minute a reminder of how far she had fallen from the life she once knew. When morning came, Emma knew it was time. She couldn't keep hiding from the truth. She had to face David, no matter how difficult it would be. It wasn't just about confronting him, it was about reclaiming her life, her identity, and finding a way to move forward. The decision wasn't easy, but she knew it was the only choice that made sense. She waited until David was settled on the couch, the typical quiet between them filling the room. There were no more words left unspoken. Everything had been said in the silence. Emma's heart pounded as she walked over to him, the photograph in her hand. She didn't say anything at first. She didn't need to. The moment David saw the image, his face drained of color. His expression flickered with guilt, but he said nothing. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. It wasn't necessary. The truth had been laid bare, and now the silence between them was deafening. Emma's chest tightened as she finally spoke, her voice steady despite the whirlwind of emotions inside her. She wasn't angry, not really. She was hurt. She had loved him, trusted him, and now it was all gone. The man she had married was no longer the man in front of her. David didn't try to defend himself. He didn't make excuses. For once, there was no denying it. He had betrayed her, and now all that was left was the fallout. Emma didn't know what would happen next. Would they try to rebuild? Or was this the end? But she knew one thing for sure, this was the beginning of something new for her. She had made the choice to confront the truth, to stop hiding from the reality that had been so difficult to accept. And with that decision, Emma felt a strange sense of relief. She didn't have all the answers, but for the first time in a long time, she knew that she was taking control of her life. The days that followed were a blur. Emma spent much of her time alone, her mind racing with the weight of everything that had happened. She had confronted David, laid the truth out in front of him, and now there was no going back. The house felt colder without the facade of normalcy that had once kept their marriage intact. The silence between them was suffocating, each word they exchanged now laced with tension and unspoken regret. David had tried to apologize, but the damage was already done. There was no undoing the betrayal, no pretending it hadn't happened. Emma couldn't bring herself to forgive him, not yet. She didn't even know if she ever could. His affair had shattered the foundation of their relationship, and no amount of regret or apologies could rebuild what had been broken. It wasn't just about the affair, though. It was about everything that had led up to it, the lies, the secrets, the things they hadn't said. Emma realized, too late, that their marriage had been built on something fragile, something that could never withstand the weight of the truth. And now, both of them were left picking up the pieces of a life that had unraveled too quickly. The emotional toll of everything was draining. Emma felt exhausted, as if the years she had spent building her life with David had been erased in an instant. She had no idea where to go from here. Should she leave? Should she try to fix things? The answers weren't clear, and part of her wasn't sure if she wanted to know the truth. The only thing she knew for certain was that she couldn't stay in this limbo forever. One evening, she packed a small bag and left. It wasn't a decision she had made lightly, but it was the only one she could make. She needed space to think, to figure out what came next. She couldn't stay in the house, trapped in the painful silence that had become her life. When she left, David didn't try to stop her. His eyes were filled with guilt and sorrow, but he didn't argue. She didn't know if that meant he understood, or if he had simply accepted that it was over. But for the first time in a long time, Emma felt a sense of freedom, however fleeting. As she walked away from the life she had known, Emma couldn't help but wonder what the future held. She didn't know if she would ever return to David or if she would find peace in a new life. But one thing was certain, she was no longer the woman she had been when all of this began. The woman who had been afraid to face the truth, the woman who had been willing to let things slide, was gone. In her place was someone new, someone who had learned that sometimes facing the truth meant tearing down everything to rebuild something stronger. As Emma drove away, she couldn't help but feel a mix of uncertainty and hope. She didn't know what was ahead, but she knew she was ready to find out.